Diaz here in the KRQE News 13 digital studio. I'm joined here with Gabrielle Burkhart, here to talk about her latest investigation. Gabby, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So this investigation I found is very intriguing, to say the least. I say that in a sense of there being a lot of questions. And if you have not watched this story yet, I highly encourage you do so. This is what it looks like here on KRQE.com. The story is titled, "This is a Mistake. Man Claims He Was Wrongfully Charged with Armed Robbery." You can see the man who has been charged there on the left, and on the right, a photo of the suspect that APD has identified in this robbery case. But I strongly encourage you to watch it before maybe taking part in this conversation. But that being said, Gabby, you're here today to talk a little bit more about what happened here. Can you tell us, for those who maybe haven't seen the story, what happened here?
Yeah, so basically there was an armed robbery that took place last July outside of a Jack in the Box on Carlisle in Northeast Albuquerque. So there's a Walmart right nearby. Witnesses say that a suspect stole a sweatshirt from the Walmart. He was captured in surveillance images from that Walmart, which you just saw one of the still images. Witnesses say that suspect then went into the Jack in the Box, waited in line. When he got a turn at the cash register, flashed a gun at the cashier, demanded cash out of the register. The cashier gets his manager. They open and give him the cash. Once he gets the cash, witnesses say the armed robber then got into a getaway car in the parking lot in the back seat. And I mention this because according to the criminal complaint, there was a getaway driver in that vehicle, and a cashier is reported to have walked out, watched the armed robber get into that getaway vehicle. He described to police seeing the driver's side window roll down and a gun pointed in his direction. Now, the cashier, the Jack in the Box employee, also told police he was also armed with a gun. So at that point, he pulled out his weapon, also fired a shot at the getaway car. He says he heard a gunshot, purportedly fired back at him. Thankfully, in this case, nobody was hit with any of those bullets, but the driver and the armed robber in this case did get away. So the whole, police investigation leads to this man in my story, which we can get into, but his name is Jaime Diaz.
Right.
And so the story is about, what led police to him, how they came to charge him with this armed robbery, and what it's been like for him the past 8 months, because he claims he is wrongfully charged in this case. That is his claim, but it is a case that's still making its way through the court system.
And Mr. Diaz, you've seen some photos, some video of him in the background video that we have going here on this story. His reaction to finding out that he was charged is something I think that is, again, another intriguing part of this story. It sounds like he thought that this was a scam, right? He receives things in the mail claiming this charge against him. And we have heard stories of people receiving phone calls, from people threatening that they need to pay money now, otherwise they're going to be arrested. So we know that scams like this are possible, they're a thing, but he did indeed think that this was a scam, huh?
Well, according to Jaime Diaz, yes, he was receiving mail at his parents' Albuquerque home. So, and I say his parents' house because he says that he lives permanently out of state, says he works as a traveling nurse's aide. So he was in Albuquerque visiting his family. He still has his parents' address on his driver's license, which is also pertinent to this story. But he was receiving these letters from private attorneys saying, basically offering to represent him, saying, we see you're charged with this felony armed robbery. And he, as he explains in my story, said, I got one letter, I threw it away, I got a second letter, threw that away. Finally, this third letter, he's like, what the heck? So he calls one of the numbers, speaks to a real attorney who's like, yeah, you are being charged with this. But then, according to Jaime Diaz, he says, I couldn't afford to pay what she was offering. He was basically saying, like, okay, well, this is a mistake. How do we fix this? Can you represent me? And he said the woman on the other line, obviously those are private attorneys, so it would have required, a retainer and some money to pay that attorney. So she actually suggested to him that he go to the public defender's office and figure out the next steps. So that's where he went to the public defender's office and got representation there. His attorney, Griffin Hardy, is interviewed in my story, and according to Mr. Hardy, he believes wholeheartedly that Jaime Diaz was not the armed robber in this case, and we can get into a little bit of why they believe that. But
yeah, before we do, I wanted to ask you again about just the process of the investigation, because it sounds like what he got in the mail was this notification, hey, you're being charged with a crime, and with that, it sounds like from watching your story, the police never interviewed Mr. Diaz before filing charges against him. And I wanted to ask you, how typical is this? Did police ever try to talk to Mr. Diaz?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we read criminal complaints, charging documents a lot, and I don't know that this data is tracked, like how often, the suspects are not interviewed, but in this case, at least to me, in reading the criminal complaint, it does not look like there was an attempt to interview him. I will say, APD did not interview with me about this case. And we can get into that as well, but they, deferred to the DA's office on this case.
I see.
The last paragraph of the criminal complaint talks about the officer writes, I believe Jaime Diaz is responsible for the armed robbery. But that is a question I had, did they knock on the door of this residence? Did they attempt to interview him? According to Mr. Diaz, they did not. He was not interviewed, which, his attorney at the public defender's office, Griffin Hardy, points out, had that warrant stayed outstanding, and had he not called the number on those letters, he probably just would have went on living life. And if you're pulled over, say, for speeding or running a stop sign, and a cop runs your, driver's license or plate and sees that you have an outstanding felony warrant, one of the things that Griffin Hardy pointed out to me is that that's a felony traffic stop. So usually it's guns drawn, get out of the car.
Yeah.
And, you can imagine if you don't know why that's happening to you, that could probably be a very frightening situation. So
Certainly.
He talked about that being, a potentially scary situation. Thankfully, it didn't happen that way, but it's just a point that was made in our discussions, in our interviews, that had he not taken any of those letters seriously, he's not sure how he would have found out that this warrant was outstanding against him.
Yeah. The DA's office, they did speak to you for this story. You spoke to a chief deputy prosecutor, Josh Boone, who's in that story again. He makes it clear that the DA's office is still pursuing this case against Diaz, despite these claims that you bring up in the story that Diaz has an alibi. So wanted to ask, here now in March, this case is still pending against Diaz, right? And they believe he is the armed robber here at this Albuquerque Jack in the Box that happened last summer?
Yeah, and I feel like I should explain a little bit more context of the alibi, right? So Diaz claims he was in Pagosa Springs, Colorado in July when this armed robbery took place.
Right, and there's some photos he provided of this, right?
He provided these photos, which, according again to his defense attorneys, they were able to timestamp them with times and dates of the armed robbery in Albuquerque. So in his mind, the way he explained it to me was, I thought I could just turn this in and they would see, okay, you clearly weren't in Albuquerque. But, and then the other point he made was, he said he lost his wallet in Pagosa Springs and that somebody turned it in to the Pagosa Springs Police Department.
Right.
And that he actually went and, he showed me this police report that appears to be from Pagosa Springs, and you see the highlighted date, July 27th. This is the date of the armed robbery. And according to this report, somebody picked up a wallet named Jaime Diaz at the Pagosa Springs Police Department. But I will say the DA's office says that they're still investigating this alibi. They want to corroborate every claim that he's making, that he was not in Albuquerque. There's this other date above that document.
Oh yeah, I
that
can
was
switch right back to
that's
that.
okay.
I'm sorry.
There's a September date on the top left.
Right.
There, so I don't, they were pointing out to me, we don't know if this is a typo. Maybe the 9 should have been a 7.
Yeah, the 9/8/22.
And then
line.
the 9/27 at the top left. So Josh Boone was just saying, we have to do our due diligence just to corroborate and make sure that these are legitimate documents, that he really was in Pacosa Springs. On the flip side, the public defender's office says, well, why didn't they do that 8 months ago? And then you kind of getting both sides, right? Josh Boone says, well, it takes time. As you hear him say in my report during our interview, he claims that what was given to the DA's office, to prosecutors, was incomplete. So they want to do, for instance, their own independent review of Jaime Diaz's GPS cell phone records, so they can do what's called a data dump and figure out, well, where was your cell phone on this date? The public defender's office says that they did that with Mr. Diaz's cell phone, but the DA's office, the prosecutors in this case, say they want to do their own review. So that's still taking place.
Okay.
But right now, as that's taking place, the criminal case is still pending.
Right.
One of the things I mentioned in my report is that originally, before I started looking into this story, there was a preventative detention motion filed by the prosecution. And that happens when somebody commits what's considered a violent crime. The prosecutors in that case will make a motion to the court saying, we believe you need to keep this suspect in jail pending trial. When I started inquiring about this case, I sat in on one of the virtual hearings, and the preventative detention motion was they withdrew that motion. So they decided not to ask that he be kept in jail pending trial, which it's unclear how long that would be, maybe months before he would get a trial. So he was thankful that they didn't petition the court to keep him in jail pending the outcome of this case. And then the judge, you also hear from in my story, looking at his background investigation, because that's another thing that's considered when a judge is deciding, okay, do I need to keep somebody in jail pending trial? Are they a danger to society? One of the things that the judge pointed out is that this Jaime Diaz has no prior felony convictions or prior, misdemeanor convictions, anything like that. So those are also taken into account when a judge is looking at least at the evidence that they have so far and deciding, okay, in this case, he decided not to put him in jail. They did what's called a book and release.
Yep.
So.
Yep. Let's talk about the criminal complaint in this case, because I think one of the interesting things you mentioned off the top is this idea that maybe 2 people were involved in this robbery, right? A getaway driver and somebody who had a gun, who went inside of the actual restaurant that was robbed. So did the criminal complaint at all leave you with any questions about this case?
Yeah, one of the questions I had after reading it and just sort of mapping out a timeline here in the investigation and the officers charging Jaime Diaz, and a question that I did ask Albuquerque Police is, well, A, does the department believe that this was a complete investigation? And is there an active investigation for the getaway driver? Because the way the criminal complaint reads, the witness describes the driver's side window rolling down, and that's when he heard the gunshot. So to me, that says, well, the getaway driver may have fired that shot then. And who is this getaway driver? Are they actively looking for him? But I did not get that answer. Albuquerque Police said, yeah, they were going to defer to the DA's office on this case.
And did they tell you anything about their investigation at all, or was that pretty much it? Like, we're deferring to the DA's office.
Yeah, that was it.
Okay.
That was pretty much it.
Nothing
I mean,
else.
I will say, the complaint lays out a lot of the investigation, and I didn't get into every single detail, but one of the details that I will share here and why police were led to Jaime Diaz in the first place is because they were able to get a partial license plate from that getaway car at the Jack in the Box. Police did what even the defense says was a good investigation. In the beginning, they traced that license plate to a vehicle at a home in Albuquerque. And then the officers, the detectives, pulled all the MVD records for everybody who had that current address. And they looked at driver's license photos and compared those driver's license photos to the surveillance images from the armed robber. And yeah, that's the part in my story where you see a pull quote, and there's the surveillance on the left and Mr. Diaz's MVD photo on the right. And the detective writes in the complaint, you know, I'm looking at these photos. I compared the driver's license photo to the Walmart photograph that shows the male's face before he commits the robbery in the Jack in the Box. And then the detective writes, I believe Jaime Diaz is the male responsible for robbing the Jack in the Box on July 27th, 2022. So that is kind of how they were able to piece together the puzzle. So there's still that question, right, of, well, if the getaway car was at that address, does anyone know who was driving the getaway car? You know, was it, I don't know.
Yeah.
Those are questions I did not get the answers to in this case that I know that are still, will probably still be investigated. Yeah.
Yeah. What is next for the case?
So, good question. I literally got a call, today's Wednesday, yesterday, from the district attorney's office letting me know that this case will be sent to a grand jury.
Okay.
So, at least for now, as I understand it, grand juries are about once a week, so it's not really clear like when that will be scheduled for, but it does give them a little bit more time to, like I said, the DA's office wants to do their own independent investigation of this alibi. So one of the things that has happened since our interviews, Mr. Diaz did his book and release. So you know, you get booked into jail, you get your photo taken, fingerprints, all of that, and then he in this case, the judge ordered to release him. So that did take place. I know that he would like this off of his record. That's a whole other question about, you know, can this be expunged? It's not clear how that works. Let's see, I'm looking at my notes here.
Yeah, that's...
He has to check in with pretrial services, his attorney weekly. One thing that the judge did allow him to do after the book and release is go home, which, again, I mentioned he lives out of state. His attorney said he's been at risk of losing his apartment since he's been gone here fighting this case in Albuquerque, so that was a good thing for him. He has, on the advice of his attorneys here, Mr. Diaz stayed in Albuquerque, you know, for the majority of the past 8 months, he says, while he's been trying to get this sorted through. So I know they're going to continue fighting for a dismissal and then an expungement. But again, the district attorney's office is still pursuing the case, actively investigating the alibi. So we'll keep an eye on it in the court system.
Certainly. Well, we appreciate you doing this story. What's a good way people can reach you?
You can always reach me via email at gabrielle.burkhart@krqe.com and then on social media at gburknm.
Okay. Thanks, Gabby.
Thank you.